December 17th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. First Lieutenant Robert Harper crouched in a snow-filled foxhole, watching through frozen field glasses as the impossible unfolded before his eyes. German armour. Not the Mark IVs or Panthers his intelligence briefings had mentioned, but the massive angular silhouettes of Tiger tanks, their 88mm guns jutting forward like the snouts of prehistoric predators. 17 of them, moving in a column along the forest road barely 300 yards from his position. His radioman, Corporal James Mitchell, pressed close against the frozen earth, his hand hovering over the transmit button, waiting for the order that every fibre of military doctrine said should come immediately. Enemy armour in the open. Artillery coordinates already plotted. A single radio call could bring down a storm of American shells that would transform the narrow forest road into a killing ground. Harper's hand came up, palm flat, a holding position. The gesture looked like indecision to anyone who didn't understand what was happening. The Tigers continued their advance, their commanders visible in open hatches, scanning the forest for threats they expected to come from ahead, not from positions they had already passed. Behind Harper, spread across a horseshoe-shaped defensive position that wrapped around the forest road, 80 American soldiers from Baker Company, 28th Infantry Division, waited with a discipline that defied every instinct screaming at them to open fire. What German intelligence had failed to discover about this particular stretch of Belgian forest was that American engineers had spent 3 days preparing it not as a forward defensive line, but as a deliberate killing zone designed to exploit one fundamental weakness in German armour tactics. The Tigers, despite their legendary armour and firepower, were moving without infantry support, their commanders confident that their 60-ton machines were invincible against anything American forces could deploy in these first chaotic days of Germany's winter offensive. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The morning had begun with artillery fire that shook the frozen ground like an earthquake, German shells falling on American positions 10 miles to the north, announcing the beginning of what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Harper's company had received fragmentary orders at 0400 hours, disconnected radio transmissions, suggesting that German forces had achieved breakthrough along multiple sectors of the American line. The phrases strategic withdrawal and consolidate positions appeared in messages that seemed to contradict themselves, creating confusion about whether Baker Company should retreat or hold their ground. Captain Thomas Winters, the battalion operations officer, had arrived at Harper's position just after dawn, his jeep sliding to a stop on the icy road with an urgency that suggested the tactical situation had deteriorated faster than anyone had anticipated. The captain carried maps marked with red arrows that showed German penetrations extending miles beyond what American defensive planning had considered possible. "Harper, we've got a fluid situation developing," Winters said, spreading his map across the hood of his jeep while German artillery continued its distant thunder. 7th Armoured is trying to reach Saint-Vith, but they're running into German columns that shouldn't exist according to our intelligence estimates. We're seeing reports of Tiger tanks operating in company strength, moving through sectors that were supposed to be held by second-line German units. Harper studied the map, noting the positions of American units and the estimated locations of German advances. The tactical picture suggested that enemy forces were exploiting gaps in American lines that had opened when units withdrew, according to contingency plans that had never anticipated the scale of the German offensive. "Sir, what are our orders?" Harper asked, already calculating the limited options available to a reinforced infantry company facing German armour without significant anti-tank support. Winters looked at the young lieutenant with an expression that suggested he was about to issue orders that existed nowhere in any official doctrine. "Battalion wants you to hold this position, but not in the way you might think. We've received intelligence that a German armoured column is moving along this forest road." He pointed to the narrow track that wound through Harper's defensive sector. "They're advancing faster than their infantry support can keep up. That creates a vulnerability." The captain pulled out a second map, this one marked with detailed terrain features and precise measurements. These woods create a natural funnel. The Germans will have to move through here in column formation. Their Tigers are too wide for off-road movement in this terrain, and they're operating under orders to maintain speed. What I'm about to tell you comes from division, and it's going to sound insane. Harper listened as Winters outlined a tactical concept that violated every principle of defensive warfare he had learned. Instead of engaging German armor from prepared positions, Baker Company would allow the Tigers to pass through their sector without firing a shot. Then, once the entire column had entered the killing zone, American forces would attack from behind, targeting the vulnerable rear armor of tanks, whose crews would be focused on threats ahead, not behind. The Tigers have frontal armor that can defeat anything we've got short of a direct hit from divisional artillery, Winters explained. But their engine decks and rear hull plates are vulnerable to our bazookas and anti-tank grenades at close range. You let them pass, then you hit them from behind when they're bunched up on this narrow road with nowhere to maneuver. The audacity of the plan was matched only by its apparent insanity. German doctrine emphasized the overwhelming firepower of their heavy armor, expecting that the mere presence of Tigers would force American units to retreat or be destroyed. By refusing to engage according to German expectations, Harper's company would be gambling that surprise and close-range attacks on vulnerable points could overcome the massive disparity in armor and firepower. Harper had deployed his 80 soldiers across positions that took advantage of every terrain feature the forest provided. The road itself ran through a shallow valley, with slopes rising 15 to 20 feet on either side, creating a natural amphitheater that would trap German armor once the ambush was triggered. His heavy weapons squad had positioned 3 bazookas teams on the high ground, with clear fields of fire down onto the road where tank engines and rear hull plates would be exposed. Sergeant First Class William Bradford, a veteran of the North Africa campaign who had fought German armor at Kasserine Pass, had taken charge of positioning the anti-tank teams. His experience with the weaknesses of German armor came from bitter lessons learned when American forces had first encountered the tactical sophistication of Wehrmacht panzer operations. Lieutenant, the Tigers' biggest vulnerability isn't their armor, it's their operational tempo, Bradford explained as they surveyed the terrain. These tanks consume fuel at a rate that makes them dependent on regular resupply. If we can disable the lead and trail vehicles, we trap the entire column. Then it's just a matter of working our way through them one at a time. The technical specifications of the Tiger tank were familiar to every American soldier who had faced German armor. 56 tons of steel protected by armor plates, ranging from 25 mm on the hull sides to 100 mm on the frontal glacis. The 88 mm main gun could penetrate American Sherman tanks at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. In any conventional engagement, a single Tiger could destroy an entire American armored platoon before sustaining damage. But the Tigers also carried limitations that German propaganda never mentioned. Their weight made them unsuitable for soft ground or narrow roads, not designed for heavy armor. Their fuel consumption of 1 gallon per mile meant that extended operations quickly depleted their limited range. Most critically, their rear armor was just 25 mm thick, barely sufficient to defeat small arms fire and vulnerable to shaped charge weapons at close range. Private First Class Tommy Chen, one of Harper's bazooka gunners, had spent the previous evening practicing target acquisition drills with empty rocket tubes, training himself to identify the precise impact points that would maximize damage against Tiger armor. The M9 bazooka, carried by American infantry, fired a 2.36-inch rocket with a shaped charge warhead designed to penetrate armor through focused explosive force rather than kinetic impact. "Sir, at what range do you want us to engage?" Chen asked, understanding that the distance between his firing position and the target would determine whether his rocket would penetrate or simply alert the Germans to the ambush. Harper had calculated the engagement geometry based on Bradford's combat experience and the technical specifications of their weapons. "Wait until they're stationary or moving slowly. Your maximum effective range against the Tiger's rear armor is 150 yards, but I want you closer, under 75 yards if possible. 1 shot, 1 kill. We won't get second chances if they realize what's happening. The deployment of American forces reflected lessons learned from previous encounters with German armor. Harper had positioned his riflemen in mutually supporting positions that could deliver concentrated small arms fire against any German infantry that might accompany the tanks. His two Browning M1919 machine guns commanded the road from elevated positions that would allow them to sweep the length of the German column. The plan required split-second timing and absolute fire discipline. Every soldier understood that opening fire prematurely would alert the Germans and allow them to deploy their superior firepower against American positions. The success of the ambush depended on allowing all 17 Tigers to enter the killing zone before triggering the attack, requiring each American soldier to watch German armor pass within grenade range without betraying their positions. Corporal Mitchell had prepared radio frequencies for artillery support, though Harper recognized that calling in fire missions against targets so close to American positions would be nearly impossible. The primary weapons for this engagement would be the bazookas, supplemented by anti-tank grenades and the few anti-tank mines that engineers had managed to position along the road without revealing the ambush. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit as dawn broke over the Ardennes, creating conditions that affected both weapons and men. The cold made metal brittle and reduced the effectiveness of explosives. Soldiers who had endured relatively quiet weeks of occupation duty in Belgium now faced combat against Germany's most feared armoured units, under conditions that tested the limits of equipment designed for more moderate climates. Harper moved through his positions in the hours before the German advance, checking on each soldier and reinforcing the importance of maintaining position regardless of what they witnessed. The psychological challenge of allowing enemy tanks to pass within killing range required a level of discipline that transcended normal training. "Remember, we're not trying to stop them from advancing," Harper told his squad leaders. "We're letting them walk into a trap. Every Tiger that passes our positions is one more tank that won't have room to maneuver when we spring the ambush. Trust the plan. Trust each other. We're going to do something today that will change how American forces fight German armor." The sound of approaching engines reached American positions at 10:15 hours, the deep rumble of Maybach power plants that drove the Tiger's massive bulk. Harper pressed himself against the frozen earth of his foxhole, using his field glasses to observe the lead elements of the German column as they entered the forest road from the north. The first Tiger appeared around a bend in the road, its commander visible in the open turret hatch, scanning the forest with field glasses identical to the ones Harper carried. The German officer showed no sign of concern, his relaxed posture suggesting confidence that any American forces in the area would have already retreated or been destroyed by the preliminary artillery bombardment. Behind the lead tank came the rest of the column, 17 Tigers moving in single file along the narrow road, maintaining intervals of approximately 50 yards between vehicles. The spacing represented standard German tactical procedure for road marches, close enough to provide mutual support, but far enough apart to minimize damage from artillery strikes. Harper counted each tank as it passed his position, noting the lack of infantry escort and the absence of reconnaissance elements that should have been screening the advance. The Germans were operating with the confidence of forces that had achieved breakthrough, expecting that American resistance would be scattered and ineffective. The 17th Tiger passed Harper's position at 10:32 hours, its engine noise gradually fading as the column continued south along the forest road. Harper waited another 5 minutes, ensuring that no additional German forces were following the armor column. Then he keyed his radio handset with 3 short clicks, the prearranged signal that would trigger the most audacious anti-tank ambush of the Western European campaign. Sergeant Bradford responded with 2 clicks, confirming that his teams were ready to execute the plan that would either vindicate Harper's tactical gamble or result in the complete destruction of Baker Company. The Tigers, oblivious to the American soldiers who had allowed them to pass unchallenged, continued their advance into the carefully prepared killing zone, where German confidence would meet American innovation in a confrontation that would redefine the tactical possibilities of infantry fighting against armor. The explosion that triggered the ambush came not from American weapons but from the lead Tiger itself, its left track detonating an anti-tank mine that engineers had buried 3 days earlier at the precise point where the forest road narrowed to its minimum width. The blast lifted the 56-ton tank's front end 18 inches off the ground before dropping it back onto shattered suspension components that left the vehicle immobile and blocking the road ahead. Before the German commander could radio a warning, Bradford's bazooka teams opened fire from positions 70 yards behind the stalled column. Private Chen's rocket hit the rearmost Tiger squarely on its engine deck, the shaped charge warhead penetrating the thin armor and detonating among the fuel and ammunition stored in the vehicle's rear compartment. The resulting explosion sent flames 50 feet into the winter air, creating a funeral pyre that blocked the Germans' only line of retreat. The 17 Tigers were now trapped between 2 disabled vehicles on a road too narrow for them to turn around. Their crews, suddenly aware that the forest they had passed through without concern now concealed an enemy that had deliberately allowed them to advance into an indefensible position. German doctrine had prepared tank commanders for frontal engagements, where their armor and firepower provided overwhelming advantages, not for ambushes that exploited the fundamental vulnerability of their rear hull plates. Obersturmführer Klaus Weber, commanding the trapped column from the 8th Tiger in line, keyed his radio with orders that reflected years of tactical training and combat experience. All vehicles, emergency reverse, watch for anti-tank teams in the forest, infantry, dismount, and sweep flanks. The commands were textbook responses to ambush, except for one critical problem. Weber had no infantry to deploy, and his tanks could not reverse in column formation without creating the kind of stationary targets that American bazooka teams had been positioned to destroy. Harper watched through his field glasses as the German response unfolded exactly as Captain Winters had predicted. The Tigers began attempting to reverse, their commanders recognizing that forward movement was impossible with the lead tank disabled. But the narrow road and close spacing between vehicles created a traffic jam that left each tank vulnerable for the precious seconds needed for American weapons to find their marks. Chen's loader, Private Marcus Williams, already had the second rocket loaded and ready before the first explosion had finished echoing through the forest. The bazooka team shifted their aim to the second-to-last Tiger, which had begun backing up in an attempt to create maneuvering room. Williams' rocket caught the vehicle while it was stationary, penetrating the engine compartment and triggering a secondary explosion as fuel ignited. 2 Tigers destroyed in the first 30 seconds. 15 remaining, their crews now fully aware that they were under attack but unable to identify the source of fire or deploy their main guns effectively against targets concealed in the forest undergrowth. The second bazooka team, commanded by Corporal Raymond Foster, had positioned themselves on the opposite side of the road with overlapping fields of fire that created a crossfire pattern impossible for German armor to evade. Foster's first rocket missed its target by 3 feet, the projectile sailing past a Tiger's turret and detonating harmlessly in the forest. His loader, Private David Sullivan, had the replacement rocket ready in 8 seconds. But by then, the Germans had begun returning fire. The Tiger's 75mm coaxial machine gun opened up, spraying the forest with 8mm rounds that shredded vegetation and sent splinters of frozen wood exploding through the air. Sullivan took a round through his left shoulder, spinning him backward and dropping him behind the cover of a fallen log. Foster grabbed the replacement rocket himself, loading it one-handed while maintaining his position behind the thick trunk of an oak tree that provided the only real cover in his sector. Sergeant Bradford had moved to a position that allowed him to observe the entire engagement, directing fire through hand signals that his teams had practiced until they could execute without verbal communication. His third bazooka team, led by Private First Class Andrew Martinez, had the clearest shot at the middle section of the German column, where tanks were bunched closest together. Martinez fired at a Tiger that had managed to traverse its turret towards suspected American positions, the rocket striking the vehicle's rear deck at an angle that maximized penetration. The shaped charge burned through 25mm of armor and continued into the fighting compartment, where it detonated ammunition stored in racks along the hull sides. The catastrophic kill sent the Tiger's turret lifting off its mounting ring before crashing back down at an angle that left the 88mm gun pointed uselessly at the sky. 3 Tigers destroyed, 14 remaining. The German column had lost 1/5 of its strength in less than 2 minutes of engagement, but the surviving tanks were beginning to respond with the professional competence that had made Wehrmacht panzer forces legendary throughout Europe. Weber's Tiger had traversed its turret to the rear, the commander having correctly deduced that the primary threat came from behind rather than ahead. The 88mm gun fired its first round at 10:37 hours, the high-explosive shell detonating against a tree trunk 20 yards from Bradford's position. The explosion created a blast wave that knocked the sergeant flat and sent shrapnel whistling through branches overhead. The tactical situation was evolving in ways that Harper had anticipated but hoped to avoid. Once German tanks began engaging with their main guns, American positions would be vulnerable to high-explosive rounds that could destroy entire foxholes with single shots. The advantage of surprise was already dissipating, replaced by a desperate, close-range battle, where German firepower threatened to overwhelm American infantry, regardless of how many tanks had been disabled. Harper keyed his radio to the frequency reserved for artillery support. Blackbird 6, this is Baker Actual. Fire mission. Coordinates previously designated as Amber 7. Danger close. Repeat, danger close. We are engaging enemy armor at ranges under 100 yards. The response came back through heavy static. Baker Actual. Confirm danger close. Artillery impact will be within 200 yards of your position. Recommend withdrawal before fire mission. Negative, Blackbird. We're committed. Execute fire mission on my command. Stand by. Harper knew that calling in artillery while American soldiers were engaged at such close range violated every safety protocol, but the alternative was watching his company be systematically destroyed by Tiger main guns. The 4th Tiger exploded as Chen's team scored their 3rd hit of the engagement, this time targeting a tank whose crew had dismounted and were attempting to locate American positions through visual observation. The bazooka rocket caught the vehicle while its hatches were open, the shaped charge penetrating into the crew compartment and killing everyone inside before they could take cover. 4 Tigers destroyed, 13 remaining. But the Germans were adapting faster than Harper had hoped, their tank commanders coordinating their response through radio communications that allowed them to concentrate fire on suspected American positions. A Tiger near the front of the column fired directly into the hillside where Foster's team had been positioned, the high-explosive round detonating against the slope and creating a landslide of frozen earth and shattered trees. Foster and Sullivan were buried under 3 feet of debris, cut off from the battle but miraculously alive in a pocket created by the fallen logs they had used for cover. The Browning machine guns opened fire for the first time, their gunners having waited for German crew members to expose themselves. The sustained rate of fire that the M1919 could maintain proved devastating against tank commanders who made the mistake of remaining in open hatches while attempting to coordinate their defense. 3 German officers were killed in as many seconds, leaving their crews buttoned up inside their vehicles and unable to effectively observe the battlefield. Private Tommy Rodriguez, operating one of the Browning guns, walked his fire across the deck of a Tiger whose commander had just been killed, the .30 caliber rounds sparking off armor but effectively suppressing any German attempt to man the tank's external machine gun. His assistant gunner, Private Leonard Jackson, fed ammunition belts smoothly while calling out targets that appeared in the chaos of the engagement. The Germans attempted their first coordinated movement at 10:40 hours, 3 Tigers, near the center of the column trying to force their way off the road and into the forest where they might have room to maneuver. The lead tank made it 15 feet before its right track sank into soft ground concealed beneath the snow, the vehicle's weight causing it to settle at a 45-degree angle that left it immobilized and vulnerable. Martinez's bazooka team shifted fire to the stranded Tiger, their rocket hitting the vehicle's side hull where armor thickness was reduced to 40 millimeters. The penetration disabled the tank's drivetrain and started a fire in the engine compartment, forcing the crew to abandon their vehicle. German tank crews emerging from disabled vehicles immediately came under fire from American riflemen, who had maintained their positions throughout the engagement. The close-range infantry action that followed demonstrated why German armor doctrine emphasized the importance of infantry support for tank operations. Weber's surviving tanks could not effectively engage American soldiers in prepared positions without exposing themselves to bazooka fire, while German crews who attempted to fight as infantry found themselves outmatched by American soldiers who had trained extensively for exactly this kind of close combat. Harper moved through his positions under fire, coordinating the actions of squads that were now fighting independent battles against an enemy force that had fragmented into isolated pockets of resistance. His company had transformed from a unified defensive position into a dozen small unit engagements, each requiring individual leadership and tactical initiative. Corporal Mitchell, still manning the radio despite having taken shrapnel wounds to his right arm, maintained communication with battalion headquarters and called in situation reports that painted a picture of controlled chaos. American casualties were mounting, but the German column was being systematically destroyed through a combination of anti-tank weapons, small arms fire, and the enemy's inability to effectively maneuver in terrain that negated their advantages in armor and firepower. The 6th Tiger destroyed was a victim of American infantry initiative rather than heavy weapons. Private Chen, having expended all his bazooka rockets, led a 3-man team that approached a disabled tank whose crew had abandoned their vehicle but left the engine running. Using thermite grenades normally reserved for destroying American equipment to prevent enemy capture, Chen dropped 2 grenades through the open commander's hatch, the burning metal igniting ammunition and fuel that gutted the Tiger from the inside. 6 Tigers destroyed, 11 remaining. But the tactical balance was shifting as German crews adapted to American tactics. Weber had managed to organize 4 tanks into a mutually supporting formation that could provide covering fire, while individual vehicles attempted to maneuver. The professional competence of Wehrmacht tank crews was beginning to overcome the initial shock of the ambush. Harper recognized the changing dynamics of the engagement and made the decision he had hoped to avoid. Blackbird 6. This is Baker Actual. Execute fire mission Amber 7. I repeat, execute fire mission. The response was immediate. Baker Actual. Rounds outgoing. Impact in 30 seconds. Take cover. The American 155mm artillery shells arrived with the distinctive whistle that every soldier learned to recognize. The high-explosive rounds detonating among the German column with devastating effect. The shells were not aimed at individual tanks, whose armor could resist everything except direct hits, but at the road itself and the spaces between vehicles where fragmentation could disable tracks, optics, and external equipment. The artillery barrage lasted 2 minutes. 18 shells fired at a rate that reflected the urgency of Harper's request. The impact pattern walked along the length of the German column, each explosion adding to the chaos and preventing any coordinated German response to the continuing American infantry attacks. When the artillery lifted at 10:44 hours, 7 more Tigers had been disabled or damaged sufficiently to prevent effective combat operations. Crews that abandoned their vehicles found themselves under fire from American riflemen who had maintained their positions throughout the bombardment. The German column that had entered the forest with confidence born of technological superiority and tactical doctrine now existed as scattered groups of soldiers fighting for survival in terrain that offered no sanctuary. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Weber emerged from his tank with his sidearm drawn, recognizing that the battle had devolved into infantry combat that his crew was not trained or equipped to win. Around him, the survivors of his command were attempting to organize defensive positions using their disabled tanks as cover, but American fire from elevated positions made such efforts nearly suicidal. The Obersturmführer had led tank operations across 3 years of war, from France through Russia and back to the Western Front. He had witnessed German armor destroy Allied forces through superior tactics and technology on dozens of battlefields. But he had never encountered an enemy willing to allow German tanks to pass before attacking from behind, exploiting the one fundamental weakness that Wehrmacht doctrine had never adequately addressed. Sergeant Bradford, bleeding from shrapnel wounds but still combat effective, led a squad-sized assault against a cluster of German infantry that had established a position behind one of the disabled Tigers. The close-quarters fighting that followed required skills that had nothing to do with anti-tank tactics, individual marksmanship, and aggressive fire and movement that American infantry had practiced until it became instinctive. Private Williams, despite his shoulder wound, continued loading rockets for Chen's bazooka team, which had found a cache of ammunition abandoned by a German supply vehicle that had been caught in the artillery barrage. The discovery allowed Chen to resume anti-tank operations against the surviving Tigers, his team working methodically through targets that presented themselves as German tanks attempted to escape the killing zone. The 14th Tiger destroyed marked a turning point in the engagement. Weber, watching from a foxhole that German infantry had hastily dug, realized that his command no longer existed as a coherent military formation. 17 tanks reduced to 3 operational vehicles, their crews scattered and fighting as infantry against an enemy that had prepared every detail of this ambush with professional competence that Weber had to grudgingly respect. Harper received reports from his squad leaders indicating that organized German resistance was collapsing, replaced by individual acts of defiance from soldiers who recognized that surrender or death were their only remaining options. The tactical victory was apparent, but the cost in American casualties would require detailed accounting once the immediate fighting concluded. Rodriguez's machine gun fell silent at 10:52 hours, its barrel overheated despite the freezing temperatures, the weapon having fired over 800 rounds during the engagement. The sudden absence of sustained fire created an eerie quiet broken only by the crackling of burning vehicles and occasional rifle shots as American soldiers cleared pockets of resistance. The last 3 operational Tigers attempted a coordinated withdrawal at 1100 hours, their commanders having abandoned any hope of completing their original mission and focused solely on survival. The vehicles began backing up simultaneously, their drivers attempting to navigate the narrow road in reverse while maintaining enough speed to escape American anti-tank fire. Martinez's team targeted the lead withdrawal vehicle, their rockets striking the Tiger's front hull where armor was thickest and failing to penetrate. But the impact damaged the driver's vision port, forcing the vehicle to slow while the driver attempted to navigate using only his limited periscope view. The delay provided Chen's team with the opportunity they needed, their rocket hitting the same tank's side hull and penetrating into the fighting compartment. 15 Tigers destroyed, 2 remaining. The survivors abandoned their vehicles and fled into the forest, their crews recognizing that continuing to fight from stationary positions would only result in their deaths. German infantry training emphasized unit cohesion and coordinated action, but the destruction of their command structure had left them without leadership or communication. Weber made the decision that would define the remainder of his military career at 11:07 hours. He ordered the surviving members of his command to cease resistance and surrender to American forces, recognizing that further fighting would accomplish nothing except additional casualties among soldiers who had already proven their courage. Harper accepted the surrender personally, emerging from his position to meet Weber in the center of the road where 17 Tigers had passed less than an hour earlier. The German officer's uniform showed the effects of combat, torn and stained with the debris of battle, but his bearing remained that of a professional soldier who had fought according to his training and doctrine. "Your men fought well," Weber said in heavily accented English, offering his sidearm in the traditional gesture of surrender. "We did not expect this. American forces do not fight this way." Harper accepted the weapon, noting the iron cross that Weber wore and the visible wounds that suggested the German officer had led from the front throughout the engagement. "We adapt," Harper replied simply, unwilling to provide tactical explanations to an enemy officer, but recognizing the professional respect that soldiers could share even in defeat. The battlefield that stretched along the forest road resembled nothing so much as a graveyard of German tactical doctrine. 17 Tigers, the most feared armored vehicles in the Wehrmacht arsenal, lay destroyed or disabled by American infantry, using weapons that German planners had dismissed as inadequate for engaging heavy armor. The tactical assumptions that had guided German operations throughout the war had met American innovation and adaptability in a forest clearing, where confidence had become a fatal liability. Bradford supervised the collection of American casualties, his medical training allowing him to perform triage while waiting for aid station personnel to reach their position. The butcher's bill was significant: 23 Americans killed and 37 wounded. But the exchange ratio, against an enemy force that should have annihilated the entire company, represented a tactical success that would influence American anti-armor doctrine for the remainder of the war. Private Chen sat against a tree trunk, his hands shaking with the adrenaline crash that followed sustained combat. His bazooka team had accounted for 6 Tiger kills, a feat that would earn him a Silver Star and a place in armor warfare case studies taught at military academies for generations. But in the immediate aftermath of battle, he could only think about William's wound and the German tank commander, whose face he had seen through his sight picture before firing the rocket that killed the man's entire crew. The intelligence exploitation of captured German equipment began within hours of the engagement's conclusion. American technical specialists documented every detail of the Tiger tanks, from armor thickness and welding patterns to the quality of optical equipment and the sophistication of radio gear. The information gathered from this single engagement would contribute to improvements in American anti-tank weapons and tactical doctrine that would benefit Allied forces throughout the final months of the war. Captain Winters arrived at Harper's position at 1300 hours, his jeep navigating carefully around the debris of battle that littered the forest road. The captain's expression reflected both satisfaction at the tactical success and concern about the casualties required to achieve it. "Division wants a full after-action report within 24 hours, Winters said, surveying the destruction with the practiced eye of a career officer who understood the significance of what had occurred. "What you accomplished here is going to change how we think about infantry engagement with armor. 80 soldiers destroying 17 Tigers represents the kind of force multiplication that strategic planners dream about." Harper nodded, too exhausted to feel pride in the prior accomplishment, but understanding its implications for future operations. "Sir, we couldn't have done this without the advanced preparation and perfect intelligence on German movements. If those Tigers had infantry support, or if they'd been more spread out, we'd be the ones surrendering." "Understood," Winters replied, "but you recognized the opportunity and executed a plan that maximized your advantages while exploiting enemy weaknesses. That's the definition of tactical competence." The collection of German prisoners revealed the quality of forces that Baker Company had defeated. Weber's command had included veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had fought against Soviet armor and survived battles where entire divisions had been destroyed. Their training and experience represented years of investment by the Wehrmacht, now lost in a single hour of fighting against American soldiers who had been in Europe less than 6 months. Medical personnel worked through the afternoon treating casualties on both sides, the artificial distinctions of nationality and allegiance temporarily suspended in favor of the universal medical imperative to preserve life. German wounded received the same care as American casualties, a practice that Weber noted with visible surprise given the propaganda he had been fed about American disregard for military convention. Private Rodriguez supervised the recovery of machine gun ammunition from the battlefield, counting 873 spent casings that represented his weapon's contribution to the engagement. The Browning M1919 had performed flawlessly throughout the battle, its sustained rate of fire proving decisive in suppressing German infantry and preventing coordinated counterattacks. The strategic implications of the engagement extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. 17 destroyed Tigers represented approximately 5% of all such vehicles operational on the Western Front in December 1944. The loss of these irreplaceable machines and their experienced crews weakened German armoured reserves at precisely the moment when the Wehrmacht's winter offensive required maximum strength. Harper's personal journal entry that evening reflected on the narrow margin between success and disaster that had characterized the engagement. "We gambled everything on a single tactical assumption, that German doctrine would not prepare them for an enemy willing to let their armor pass before attacking. The gamble paid off. but I saw at least 3 moments where German adaptation could have turned the battle against us. Courage and firepower matter, but so does the enemy's willingness to think beyond their training. Sergeant Bradford received treatment for his wounds at the aid station, refusing evacuation until he had personally accounted for every member of his squad. His leadership during the engagement would earn him a battlefield commission to second lieutenant, recognition of the tactical skill that had made the ambush possible. But Bradford's most significant contribution came in the detailed after-action reports he compiled, documenting the specific techniques that had proven effective against Tiger armor. The captured German documents discovered among Weber's personal effects revealed planning for operations far more ambitious than a simple armored thrust through American lines. The Tigers had been the advance guard of a larger offensive designed to recapture territory and disrupt Allied supply lines. Their destruction forced German commanders to cancel follow-on operations and reassess their assumptions about American defensive capabilities. Private Chen's letter home 3 days after the battle attempted to explain experiences that defied civilian comprehension. "We did something today that the army will probably study for years. We let German tanks pass right by us, so close I could have touched them, then we hit them from behind. But I don't think I really understood how scared I was until it was over. The guys who didn't make it deserved better than dying in a frozen forest in Belgium, but at least we made their sacrifice mean something." The technical analysis of destroyed Tigers provided American engineers with data that would influence tank destroyer development and anti-armor weapon design. The confirmation that shaped charge weapons could defeat Tiger armor from specific angles and ranges validated ongoing research programs and accelerated deployment of improved bazooka variants to frontline units. Captain Winters's official report to division headquarters emphasized the importance of terrain selection and advance preparation in enabling infantry to defeat superior armored forces. His recommendations included increased allocation of anti-tank weapons to rifle companies and expanded training in ambush tactics that exploited the operational limitations of German armor. The memorial service held for 23 Americans killed during the engagement took place in the same forest where they had died, with German prisoners standing at attention alongside American survivors. Weber, in a gesture that transcended national animosity, placed flowers on the graves of soldiers whose weapons had destroyed his command, acknowledging the universal respect that warriors could share regardless of which flag they served. Harper's promotion to captain came through 2 weeks after the engagement, along with orders assigning him to division staff where his expertise in anti-armor operations would inform planning for future engagements. But the lieutenant resisted the promotion initially, unwilling to leave the soldiers who had trusted his judgment and executed his plans with the professionalism that had made victory possible. The broader tactical lessons from the Ardennes Forest ambush spread through American forces with remarkable speed. Infantry companies across the European theatre received training bulletins detailing the techniques that Baker Company had employed, emphasizing the importance of patience, preparation, and understanding enemy doctrine well enough to exploit its weaknesses. Private Williams returned to duty 6 weeks after sustaining his shoulder wound, insisting on rejoining Chen's bazooka team, despite offers of reassignment to less hazardous duties. His dedication exemplified the unit cohesion that developed among soldiers who had survived combat together, bonds stronger than those created by any amount of peacetime training. The strategic impact of the engagement resonated through German command structures as senior officers attempted to understand how elite armored forces had been destroyed by American infantry. The after-action reports prepared by surviving German officers emphasized the need for combined arms operations and better reconnaissance, but these lessons came too late to affect the outcome of a war that Germany was already losing. Weber spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner camp where he compiled detailed analyses of the engagement, attempting to identify the specific tactical errors that had led to disaster. His writings, discovered decades later by military historians, provided insights into how professional German officers perceived American military capabilities and the evolution of their tactical thinking as the war turned against them. The Forest Road, where 17 Tigers met their end, became a pilgrimage site for veterans and military historians, the wreckage of German armour serving as testament to an engagement that challenged conventional wisdom about the supremacy of armoured warfare. Markers placed years after the battle identified the positions where American soldiers had crouched in frozen foxholes, watching German confidence roll past before springing the trap that would validate new approaches to anti-armour combat. Harper's final reflection on the engagement, written 30 years later for a military history journal, captured the essence of what had occurred in those desperate hours. We succeeded not because we were braver or better equipped than the Germans, but because we were willing to fight in ways that their doctrine told them were impossible. Sometimes the greatest tactical advantage comes not from superior weapons or numbers, but from understanding that the enemy's greatest strength can also be their most exploitable weakness. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.